They called her a monster. A vulture in a nanny's uniform, circling dying children. The headlines screamed it, the cameras flashed it, and in the sterile, suffocating silence of the courtroom, every eye condemned her. For 5 years, Eliza Vance had been the angel in the House of Shadows, the woman who dedicated every waking second to the 2 fragile sons of the titan of industry, Damian Blackwood. Now, they said she was their executioner, accused of a crime so vile it defied imagination, stealing the life-saving medication from the very boys she claimed to love like her own. With no money, no lawyer, and a world hungry for her downfall, she walked into the lion's den alone, a lamb thrown to wolves, surrounded by the predatory clicks of cameras and the crushing weight of judgment. Just when the gavel was about to fall, just when it seemed like all hope had been ground to dust, the great oak doors of the courtroom swung open. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Every head turned, every whisper died. Damian Blackwood's fragile twin sons had arrived, and what they were about to say would detonate a truth so explosive it would tear down an empire. Before we dive into the heart of this unbelievable story, do us a favor and smash that subscribe button and give this video a big thumbs up. Oh, and we absolutely love hearing from you, so drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. You won't want to miss a single second of this. Eliza Vance's life had been measured in the quiet hums and beeps of medical equipment for half a decade. She was the live-in caregiver at Blackwood Manor, a sprawling Gothic estate in upstate New York that felt more like a museum than a home. Her job, her entire existence, revolved around caring for Leo and Theo, Damian Blackwood's 10-year-old twin sons. They had been diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy, a merciless genetic disease that was methodically stealing their ability to move, to breathe, to live. Their survival depended on one of the most expensive medications ever created, a drug so precious it was stored in a temperature-controlled, biometrically sealed vault in the mansion's west wing. Over the years, the sterile lines of employment had blurred into the messy, beautiful contours of family. Eliza was more than a nanny. She was their fortress. She fed them, turned them in their beds, administered their complex treatments, played video games with them for hours, and held their hands through nights so dark and full of pain that the mansion itself seemed to groan in sympathy. She had become their mother in every way but blood. Then, one cold Tuesday morning, the world tilted on its axis. Damian Blackwood summoned her to his study. The room was like the man himself, immense, intimidating, and paneled in dark wood that seemed to absorb all light and warmth. She assumed it was a routine update on the boy's condition. Instead, he stared at her, his face a mask of granite, his eyes as cold and gray as the winter sky outside. Without a preamble, without a single tremor of doubt in his voice, he accused her of stealing the children's medicine. The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, nonsensical and alien. Then they landed sharp and heavy, knocking the air from her lungs. A cold dread, slick and oily, slithered up her spine. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. "What?" she managed to whisper, the single word cracking in the oppressive silence. Her hands started to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable tremor she tried to hide by clenching them into fists. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't understand. That's impossible." She denied it, her voice a ragged plea. She repeated it, over and over, a desperate mantra against the encroaching nightmare. "I would never. I haven't taken anything. You have to believe me." But Damian didn't move. His expression was utterly devoid of emotion, a chilling blankness that was far more terrifying than rage. He told her that a month's supply of neurolixia was missing. 3 full doses. And she, he said with a terrifying finality, was the only person besides himself with access to the vault. Eliza knew the medicine was priceless, that each dose was worth more than a luxury car, but she had never once thought of it in terms of money. Her entire universe had been focused on the boys, on their next breath, their next small victory against the disease that held them captive. She pleaded with him, her mind racing, searching for any other explanation. It had to be a mistake. A clerical error in the inventory, a malfunction in the storage system. Maybe someone else had gained access. A disgruntled former employee, a delivery person, anyone but her. He didn't listen. He leaned back in his leather throne of a chair, the springs groaning in protest, and spoke with a slow, deliberate cruelty. "You're going to pay for this." The vast room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in, squeezing the very air from her. Damien stood and circled the massive desk, his movements slow and predatory. He stopped just a few feet from her, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that made her skin crawl. "No one will believe you," he hissed. "I'm Damien Blackwood. You're just the nanny. Who do you think they'll take sides with?" Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging, but she fought to hold them back. Her mind was a maelstrom of frantic questions. Who could have done this? Who would want to hurt Leo and Theo in such a monstrous way? She mentally scrolled through every person who had been to the mansion recently. A new physical therapist, a team of landscapers, but she always came back to the same dead end. She was meticulous. The vault was a fortress within a fortress. She followed every protocol to the letter. The idea that anyone, especially Damien, could believe she was capable of harming the twins was a physical pain, a sharp blade twisting in her gut. As he continued his monologue of condemnation, Eliza felt herself sinking into a black abyss. His words were like stones, each one a calculated blow. He talked about the black market, how a single dose could fetch hundreds of thousands of dollars. He accused her of seeing his dying sons as a winning lottery ticket, of valuing money more than their very lives. A deep, guttural sob escaped her lips. The thought of the boys suffering, of their condition worsening because someone believed she was a common thief, made her want to scream until her throat was raw. She tried to tell him, to remind him of everything they had been through together. The late-night ER visits, the terrifying moment when Leo's ventilator failed, the countless hours she spent researching new therapies. She had been there through all of it. But it was like speaking a language he no longer understood. He had already convicted her in the courtroom of his mind. He was already talking about the police, about his lawyers, about prison. She was helpless. Her words were ghosts, her voice an echo in a void. Her mind flashed back to 1,000 small moments that had become the fabric of her life. Holding their hands while they slept, their small fingers curled around hers. The private jokes they shared. The way Theo would smile, a slow, brilliant sunrise of a smile, whenever she read him his favorite book. These boys weren't a job. They were her heart, walking or rolling outside of her body. And now all of that was being systematically erased by one monstrous accusation. She knew she was innocent, but a cold, terrifying certainty settled in her soul. In a war against a man like Damien Blackwood, innocence was a pitifully inadequate shield. His name was a weapon. His wealth was an army. The worst part wasn't the thought of jail. It wasn't the destruction of her reputation. The real agony, the thought that threatened to shatter her completely, was that the boys might believe it. That they might think their Eliza, their fortress, had betrayed them. She had spent years building their trust, brick by painstaking brick. They depended on her for everything. The idea of looking into their eyes and seeing fear, or worse, disappointment, was an unbearable torture. In that moment, she felt as if she had already lost everything that mattered. And yet, a tiny, defiant ember of fight still glowed in the darkness. She couldn't let this be the end. She had to prove her innocence, not for herself, but for them. But standing there, in Damian Blackwood's cold, merciless study, all she could do was deny it one last time, her voice cracking under the weight of her tears. "I didn't do it." The conversation ended with his final, chilling warning. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," he said, turning his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. Eliza stood frozen for a beat, her body numb. Then she turned and walked out of the room on legs that felt like hollow reeds. She moved down the familiar hallway, past the portraits of Blackwood ancestors whose cold eyes seemed to follow her, judging her. As she reached the grand foyer, she glanced up the sweeping staircase that led to the twins' wing. An overwhelming urge to run to them, to hold them, to explain that it was all a horrible mistake, washed over her. But she couldn't. She was contaminated. Branded. She stepped out the front door into the biting New York air, unsure if she would ever be allowed to return. The pain of the accusation was nothing compared to the gut-wrenching agony of being cast as the villain in the story of the two boys she loved more than life itself. Eliza sat on the hard, unforgiving wood of the courtroom bench, a solitary island in a sea of hostility. Her hands, resting in her lap, were trembling so badly she had to clench them together. She was wearing her simple nanny's uniform, the same one she'd worn while wiping away the boys' tears and cheering their smallest accomplishments. It felt like both an armor and a condemnation. Around her, the air was thick with judgment, every cough and shuffle of paper echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous room. The large double doors at the back of the court swung open, and Damian Blackwood entered. He moved not like a man, but like a force of nature, clad in a suit so dark and perfectly tailored it seemed to absorb the light around him. He was flanked by a team of 3 lawyers and 2 imposing men who could only be private security. He walked with the unshakable confidence of a king entering his own throne room, utterly certain of the outcome before the battle had even begun. Murmurs followed him like a wake behind a ship, people turning, whispering, nodding in his direction. No one looked at Eliza. It was as if she were already a ghost. When the judge entered, a stern-faced woman with tired eyes, the room rose in unison. The trial began. Eliza tried to steady her breathing, but her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. No family, no friends, and no lawyer. The public defender assigned to her had called that morning, his voice full of apology, explaining he'd been pulled onto a last-minute, higher-profile case. She was on her own. It was her, a nanny with a savings account that barely hit 4 figures, against a billionaire and his legal armada. The prosecution started, and one of Damian's lawyers, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman named Caroline Sterling, approached the lectern. Her voice was smooth and confident, each word a carefully polished stone hurled in Eliza's direction. She painted a picture of a manipulative, greedy woman who had cynically exploited the trust of a grieving family. She spoke of a calculated plan, of Eliza knowing the schedules, the security blind spots, the exact value of the medicine she was allegedly stealing. She described the neurolixia not as a life-saving drug, but as liquid gold, worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. Then came the killing blow. Ms. Sterling looked directly at the jury box and said, with theatrical gravity, that Eliza Vance saw 2 sick, helpless children not as human beings, but as an opportunity. A means to an end. Eliza wanted to leap to her feet, to scream that it was all lies, that her love for those boys was the purest thing in her life. But her throat was a knot of unshed tears and silent rage. In the gallery, people whispered and shook their heads, their faces a mixture of pity for the family and disgust for her. The story, as twisted as it was, made a sick kind of sense to them. The prosecutor continued, her voice ringing with false righteousness. She claimed Eliza had siphoned off the medication to sell to the highest bidder on the international black market. "This wasn't just theft, ladies and gentlemen," she boomed, her voice echoing in the silent room. "This was a potential death sentence, signed and delivered by the one person they trusted to protect them." Journalists in the press box scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like insects. To them, this was a juicy story. The rich father, the dying twins, the betrayal of the nanny. To Eliza, it was the methodical demolition of her life. She listened as the narrative of her existence was rewritten into a sordid crime drama. She had no one to object, no one to challenge the claims. Every word from the prosecutor felt like a physical blow. They presented evidence, photographs of the empty boxes from the vault, security logs showing she was the only one who had accessed it on the days in question. Eliza knew there were explanations, context that was being deliberately ignored, but no one was asking for it. Finally, the judge, her face impassive, asked if she wished to make a statement. Her mouth was as dry as dust, but she forced herself to her feet and approached the witness stand. She gripped the wooden rail, her knuckles white. Her voice, when it came, was a fragile, trembling thing. She said she had never taken anything. She said she loved Leo and Theo more than anything, that she had dedicated her life to them. But after only a few sentences, Judge Miller cut her off. "We will focus on the facts, Ms. Vance, not on emotion." Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. She returned to her seat, the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on her. The audience had already made up their minds. She was the villain of the story. She was poor, unconnected, and looked exactly like someone who would lose a case like this. Damien, by contrast, was the picture of stoic grief. When he was called to the stand, he spoke of the profound trust he had placed in Eliza. He said he had treated her like a member of the family, and that her betrayal had shattered him. His only concern, he stated, his voice thick with contrived emotion, was the protection of his vulnerable children. The judge listened to him with rapt attention. Eliza wanted to scream that he was the one who betrayed their bond, who refused to listen, who chose to believe the worst of her without a shred of real proof. But looking around the courtroom, at the sea of judgmental faces, she knew it was pointless. No one questioned his narrative. No one considered that she might be the victim. The evidence presentation continued. They brought in boxes of documents. They played security footage of Eliza entering the West Wing corridor that led to the vault. The footage was grainy and silent, stripped of all context. She had gone in to perform her daily inventory check, a task she performed with religious diligence. But in court, it was presented as a smoking gun. A former housekeeper was called to the stand and testified that Eliza always seemed too involved with the children, as if that were a crime. Another staff member recalled hearing Eliza once comment that the medicine cost more than a house. Eliza remembered the conversation perfectly. She had said it in awe and horror at the price of health care, not with envy. But no one asked for her side. They only wanted her to sit there, silent and condemned, as they dismantled her character piece by piece. Even the judge seemed weary of the proceedings, as if Eliza's presence was a mere formality on the path to a foregone conclusion. As the session neared its end, a profound exhaustion settled deep in her bones. This wasn't a court of law. It was a theater of power. Every scripted word, every dramatic pause, every flash of a camera was a reminder that this was never about the truth. It was about narrative, and Damian Blackwood was the master narrator. She thought of the twins again. Were they at home, watching this on the news? Had Damian told them what he was doing, what he believed she had done? Would they believe him? That thought was a physical ache in her chest, a twisting knot of agony. The judge announced a recess, stating the court would resume in 2 days after reviewing the initial evidence. Eliza barely heard him. She just kept thinking about how no one in that room, not a single person, saw her for who she was. She stood slowly, her body feeling 100 years old, and cast one last look at Damian. He refused to meet her gaze. She walked out of the courtroom, the invisible weight of a guilty verdict already pressing on her shoulders. She realized then, with chilling clarity, that the court had already chosen its champion. And it wasn't her. Eliza sat on the courtroom bench, feeling the last vestiges of her strength crumble. Her hands were ice cold, her legs felt like lead. As the trial resumed, Caroline Sterling, Damian's lead attorney, stood with a confident smirk. She announced they had new, conclusive evidence. On the large screen at the front of the court, a video played. It was security footage, sharp and clear, seemingly from a camera inside the mansion's main office. It showed a woman with Eliza's build and hair, wearing her uniform, moving toward one of Damian's private safes, inputting a code and opening it. A wave of nausea hit Eliza. The video felt deeply wrong, like a distorted dream. She had never been near those safes. Her duties were strictly confined to the care of the twins. She had no access to or knowledge of Damian's financial affairs. But the image on the screen was undeniably her. Or a perfect facsimile of her. Ms. Sterling let the video play on a loop as she explained that this was proof of a larger pattern of theft. Then, she projected another document onto the screen. Bank records. They showed an offshore account, opened under the name Eliza Vance, with a series of large, anonymous deposits made just days after the medication had gone missing. The total amounted to nearly $500,000. Eliza's mouth fell open. A strangled sound escaped her throat. She had never seen that account, never even heard of the bank it was with. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That's not me! That's not real!" she cried out, her voice raw with panic. "I've never seen that account in my life!" The judge briefly allowed her to speak. Looking wildly around the room, her voice rising in hysteria, she insisted the video had to be manipulated. A deep fake, something fabricated. She explained that her bank account was with a local credit union, and her balance was pathetically low. But before she could say more, Ms. Sterling loudly objected. "Your Honor, the defendant is becoming hysterical. The evidence speaks for itself." The judge sustained the objection and sternly told Eliza to sit down. She tried again, her voice cracking. "Someone is framing me!" But the judge banged her gavel, silencing her with a glare that could freeze fire. Ms. Sterling, her composure flawless, stood once more. She spoke in a calm, measured tone that made the fabricated evidence seem all the more real. She reiterated that Eliza had abused the trust of a family that had treated her as one of their own. She claimed Eliza used her role as a caregiver to map out the house's vulnerabilities, planning this heist for months. The lawyer's words were strong, firm, and utterly convincing. She pointed to the footage, the bank records, the missing medicine, weaving them together into an airtight narrative of greed and betrayal. She looked at the judge, then at the jury, and requested an immediate guilty verdict. Eliza sat frozen, her world imploding. Every piece of her life was being twisted into a weapon against her. She thought of the countless nights she had stayed up, monitoring the boys' breathing, adjusting their ventilators, her own exhaustion a distant concern. She had worked weekends, holidays, and even when she was sick with the flu, never wanting to leave their side. Now, all of that devotion, all of that love, was being erased by a cascade of sophisticated lies. She wanted to demand an expert to analyze the video, a forensic accountant to trace the money, but she had no one. No one was listening. The courtroom only heard the story Damian Blackwood's money had bought, and it was a story that starred her as the villain. The judge made notes, his face a neutral mask. He didn't look angry, but he didn't look skeptical either. Eliza watched him, desperate for a flicker of doubt, a sign that he saw through the charade, but there was nothing. He just kept writing. The audience in the gallery was no longer whispering. They were staring at her with open hostility. She was no longer a person to them. She was a monster, a criminal who preyed on dying children. She remembered when the twins were first diagnosed. She had spent weeks at the hospital with them, learning from the nurses how to operate their complex machinery, how to spot the subtle signs of respiratory distress. She had done things that terrified most people, and she had done them with love, never once asking for more money or recognition. Her only reward was their safety. Now those memories felt like they belonged to another life, a life buried under the rubble of this waking nightmare. Eliza looked toward the back of the courtroom, a desperate, childish hope flickering within her that someone who knew the truth would burst through the doors and save her. But the doors remained closed. Her chest felt so tight she could barely breathe. She thought of the time Theo had a high fever and was delirious with pain. She had sat by his bed for 36 straight hours, singing softly to him until the fever broke. She thought of the hundreds of pictures they had drawn together, proudly displayed on the walls of their room, many of them depicting her as a superhero they called Aunt Eliza. Those moments were the truest parts of her life. But here, in this cold, formal room, in front of these strangers, they meant nothing. The lawyers spoke with absolute certainty. The evidence looked irrefutable, and the judge asked no challenging questions. Eliza had nothing left but her own word, and in the face of such a well-orchestrated lie, her word was worth less than dust. She wiped a tear from her eye, trying not to let them see her break. The judge announced a short recess before the final arguments. As people stood and stretched, some walking out to feed sound bites to the ravenous reporters outside, Eliza remained in her seat, staring at the polished floor. She felt crushed, not just by the weight of the accusations, but by the terrifying ease with which everyone had turned against her. She was one person against an army. She had no money, no power, no influence. The edited footage, the fraudulent bank account, the cold, accusatory stares. They were walls of a prison closing in around her. Even though she knew the truth, it felt utterly, hopelessly irrelevant. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the splintering pieces of her sanity together. All she could think about were the boys. She had loved them with the fierce, unconditional love of a mother. And now, thanks to this elaborate, cruel performance, the world, and perhaps even they, would remember her as the woman who tried to kill them for profit. Eliza returned to her small, barren apartment, the courtroom's oppressive atmosphere clinging to her like a shroud. The silence in the room was a deafening roar in her ears. She slid down the kitchen wall until she was huddled on the cold linoleum floor, hugging her knees to her chest as the first dry, racking sob escaped her. The carefully constructed dam of her composure finally broke, and a flood of grief, rage, and terror poured out. She cried until her body ached, until her throat was raw, every part of her feeling fractured beyond repair. Images of the twins assaulted her mind's eye. Leo's small, fragile hand wrapping around her pinky finger. Theo's infectious giggle when she made silly faces. The time they both fell asleep on her lap during a movie, their combined weight a comforting, precious burden. They had, once, in a moment of unguarded affection, called her Mommy Eliza. The name wasn't just a sweet slip of the tongue. It was a testament to the bond they shared, a recognition of the love and trust she had so carefully nurtured. And now, the world believed she had desecrated that trust in the most monstrous way imaginable. The pain of that thought was a living entity, clawing at her from the inside. She slowly, unsteadily, got to her feet and walked to a small bookshelf. Tucked between worn paperbacks was a framed photo of the boys, taken on their last birthday. They were in matching superhero t-shirts, their smiles wide and genuine despite the cruel limitations of their bodies. She picked it up, her thumb stroking the cool glass over their faces. It wasn't just her freedom on the line anymore. It was her legacy in the hearts of the only two people who mattered. If she was found guilty, they would grow up believing the lies. They would remember her as the woman who sold their future for a bag of silver. How could they ever know the truth if the world around them was built on a foundation of deceit? She sat at her small, wobbly kitchen table, the photo held tightly in her hands. She had no lawyer. She had no money. No one had called to offer support. The news reports were a relentless barrage of character assassination, with headlines branding her the nanny of nightmares. Strangers on the internet, emboldened by anonymity, called her evil, heartless, and worse. People who had never met her, who knew nothing of her life, were calling for her to be locked away forever. She wanted to scream until the windows shattered that none of it was true, that she had poured her soul into caring for those children. But who would listen? She had no proof, no allies, no voice that could penetrate the wall of condemnation Damian Blackwood had built around her. For a terrifying moment, the thought of giving up felt like a sweet relief. Maybe it would be easier to just let the current take her, to stop fighting. At least then the shame, the pressure, the crushing loneliness would end. She walked to the window and stared down at the dark, empty street. The city was quiet, but her mind was a battlefield. Could she truly live with the knowledge that Leo and Theo would grow up hating the memory of her? Could she allow that poison to infect their childhood? She closed her eyes, and the memories returned, not as torment, but as a lifeline. She remembered the long nights spent by their bedsides, a cool cloth on their feverish brows. She remembered mastering the intricate workings of their medical equipment, her hands steady and sure during emergencies that would have made others panic. She remembered the weight of their sleeping bodies against hers. These were not the actions of a monster. These were acts of profound love. The thought of those boys being told she never cared for them, that it was all an act, made Eliza physically sick. Her hands, which had been trembling, slowly clenched into fists. No, she would not let that happen. Even if the entire world stood against her, she would not turn her back on them. They deserved to know the truth. She had to fight, not for her own sake, but for the sanctity of their memory of her. That single thought was a spark in the overwhelming darkness. Eliza walked to the small, cracked mirror in her hallway and forced herself to look. The woman staring back was a stranger. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, her face gaunt with stress. Her clothes seemed to hang off her diminished frame. But beneath the exhaustion and the fear, she saw something else. She saw the woman who had stayed. The woman who had fought alongside two little boys against an unbeatable disease. That woman wasn't a quitter. That woman didn't run. Eliza leaned closer to her reflection, her breath fogging the glass, and whispered, "You are not guilty." She said it again, louder this time, and again, until the tremor left her voice. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer all-consuming. It now had to share space with a fierce, unwavering resolve. She walked back to the table, took a deep, steadying breath, and made her decision. She would go back to that courtroom. She would face the judge, the lawyers, the cameras, and Damian Blackwood himself, because giving up was no longer an option. The next morning she woke before dawn. Her body felt like it was filled with lead, but she forced herself to move. She didn't own a suit or any clothes that could project an image of power, so she chose her nanny's uniform again. It was a declaration. It was who she was. She gathered the few papers she had, her employment contract, her handwritten notes on the boy's care, and tucked the photo of the twins into her bag. She took the bus to the courthouse, sitting in the back, watching the city wake up. She knew the risks. She knew she could be led from that courtroom in handcuffs, but the thought of Leo and Theo growing up with a lie was a sentence far worse than any prison. Eliza Vance was not going to let Damian Blackwood write their story. She walked up the cold, imposing steps of the courthouse, her stride slow but deliberate. She was ready to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. On the second day of the trial, Eliza entered the courtroom with a heavy heart, but a straight back. She kept her head high, refusing to shrink under the accusatory glares of the gallery. As she took her seat at the defense table, she saw Damian already in his place, whispering with Ms. Sterling, a look of calm certainty on his face. The session began, and Damian's team moved in for the kill. They announced they had one final piece of evidence. On the screen, a series of text message screenshots appeared. Ms. Sterling explained, her voice dripping with theatrical sorrow, that these were messages recovered from Eliza's old phone, communications between her and a supposed black market contact. The texts were chillingly specific, discussing prices, pickup logistics, and the exact dosage of neurolixia. Phrases like shipment ready and same purity as discussed were highlighted in red. Eliza's blood ran cold. The messages were masterful forgeries, but they used her name, and the timestamps corresponded with the dates the medicine vanished. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed, as the crowd behind her gasped and murmured in open disgust. The prosecution dissected each message, building a narrative of a cold, calculating criminal mastermind. Eliza sat there, stunned into silence. She couldn't comprehend the level of malice required to orchestrate such a deception. She tried to interject, to explain that her old phone had been broken and discarded weeks ago, but the judge silenced her with a sharp rap of his gavel. The people in the audience were visibly outraged. They looked at her as if she were the devil incarnate. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her nails digging into the wood. Across the room, Damian watched her, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. He didn't have to say a word. He believed he had already won. Eliza looked down, the lump in her throat making it hard to breathe. She had nothing. No evidence to counter theirs, no expert to debunk the forgeries, no lawyer to fight for her. She was losing, and she was losing fast. She looked at Damian again. He was calmly adjusting his tie, the picture of a man in complete control. The fabricated video, the fake bank account, and now these messages. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a conspiracy. A cold, terrifying question began to form in her mind. Why? Why would a man with infinite resources go to such extraordinary lengths to destroy a simple nanny? Was it purely about power? About making an example of her? Or was there a darker secret he was trying to bury? She fought back the tears threatening to spill. She had to be strong, not for the people in this room, but for the boys, She had to hold on to the truth, even if she was the only one left who believed it. And then, something happened that no one could have predicted. Just as the judge was about to move toward final arguments, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Every head swiveled. For a moment, there was only confused silence. Then, a collective gasp swept through the room. Entering through the doors were Leo and Theo. Leo was using a small, specialized walker, his legs trembling with the monumental effort of each step. His face was pale and beaded with sweat, but his eyes were wide and fiercely determined. Beside him, Theo maneuvered his motorized wheelchair, his small hands expertly guiding the joystick as he kept pace with his brother. They were dressed in simple, comfortable clothes, and their eyes scanned the hostile room until they found her. The entire courtroom fell silent. The whispers, the tension, the very air seemed to freeze. Even the judge stopped writing, his pen hovering over the page. The presence of these two fragile children was a seismic event. No one had expected this. The sheer physical struggle it must have taken them to get here was a testament more powerful than any legal argument. Eliza's mouth fell open. Her body was paralyzed with shock. She had no idea they were coming. Seeing them there, in the heart of this circus, sent a jolt through her that was equal parts love, pride, and heart-wrenching pain. The crowd was utterly still. Even Damien looked stunned, his smug composure finally cracking. He leaned forward, the smirk gone, replaced by a look of disbelief. The boys said nothing as they made their slow, arduous journey up the center aisle. They didn't need to. Their presence was a shout in the silent room. It declared their allegiance. It showed the world who they trusted. The simple act of moving, one brother pushing through immense pain, the other guiding himself with quiet resolve, spoke more truth than anything Damien's high-priced lawyers had said. Eliza felt something shift in the atmosphere. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. Her boys had come for her. With a determination that silenced the entire courtroom, Leo and Theo made their way to Eliza. Every eye followed their slow, painful progress. Leo's arms shook as he gripped the walker, each step a monumental victory over his own body. Theo stayed right beside him, his expression serious and focused. The room was so quiet you could hear the soft whir of his wheelchair's motor. When they finally reached the defense table, they both turned to Eliza. Leo let go of his walker, his small body lurching forward as he wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach and sobbing quietly. From his chair, Theo reached out and took her hand, his small fingers gripping hers with surprising strength. Eliza was speechless. Tears streamed down her face as her arms instinctively went around them, holding them in a fierce, protective embrace. They had come, on their own. They had chosen to stand with her. Leo looked up, his face tear-streaked, his eyes red. He looked directly at the judge, and though his voice was weak, it carried through the silent room with perfect clarity. "She didn't steal anything," he said. "She's our mommy Eliza. She takes care of us." Theo, still holding her hand, added, "We saw other people by the medicine room. When Daddy wasn't home, we tried to tell him." The courtroom was frozen. The truth, raw and simple, delivered by the two people who mattered most, had finally been spoken. The judge stared at the boys, his pen forgotten in his hand. People in the audience covered their mouths, their previous certainty shattered. These two children had done what no adult could. They had changed the narrative with nothing but their own honesty. Suddenly, Damien shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. "This is absurd," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at his sons. "They don't know what they're saying. They're children. They're sick. They're easily confused." His voice cracked with a desperation that bordered on panic. Before he could continue his tirade, the judge slammed her gavel down, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. "Enough, Mr. Blackwood," she commanded. "Let them finish." Damien tried to speak again, but the judge raised a hand. "Sit. Down." Defeated, he slowly sank back into his chair, his face a mask of fury and frustration. The boys continued, their voices gaining strength. "She always gives us our medicine right on time," Leo said. "She reads to us until we fall asleep when we're scared," Theo added. Their words were not a legal testimony. They were a testament of love. That simple truth cut through the web of lies like a razor. The audience, once so quick to condemn her, now listened in rapt silence. Some wiped tears from their own eyes. It wasn't just what the children said, but the fact that they were here at all. Their journey to this courtroom was an act of incredible courage and love. They had stood up for Eliza when the entire world had abandoned her. That kind of loyalty couldn't be faked. It couldn't be bought. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Eliza didn't feel alone. She felt surrounded by the most powerful army in the world. She held her boys close, kissing the tops of their heads. Her tears were no longer tears of despair, but of overwhelming gratitude and hope. She looked around the room and saw the change on people's faces. The judgment was gone, replaced by understanding, and in some cases, shame. The reporters had lowered their cameras. The judge now looked at her with a new, thoughtful expression. Damien's lawyers were silent. His confident facade had crumbled, revealing the desperate man beneath. Everything had changed, not because of a legal maneuver, but because two little boys had bravely spoken the truth. The judge leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Can you tell me exactly what you saw?" she asked the boys. They nodded. Theo began to describe a night a few weeks ago. He had seen two people he didn't recognize near the storage vault. They were with his father's lawyer, Miss Sterling. He remembered hearing them talk about a special delivery. They had tried to tell their father, but he had dismissed it as a dream, a side effect of their medication. So they had kept it to themselves, until now. The courtroom listened, spellbound. The judge took slow, careful notes. Even the prosecution team seemed to be listening without protest. Eliza squeezed their hands, whispering a silent, "Thank you." The truth was finally out, and the whole world was listening. After a short break, the judge called the court back to order and announced that the twins' testimony would be officially entered into the record. Court officers gently helped them to the witness stand. The judge spoke to them kindly, and they both nodded ready. Leo went first. He described in simple, heartfelt detail how Eliza was the center of their world. He talked about how she knew their needs before they did, how she never once complained, and how she made their difficult lives feel safe and full of love. Then it was Theo's turn. He looked directly at the judge and recounted the night he couldn't sleep. He had heard footsteps, and, peeking through his door, saw Caroline Sterling walking away from the vault. He said she was carrying a small, insulated box and looked around nervously before disappearing down the hall. His brother confirmed he had seen it too. Hearing them both tell the same story, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. The focus had shifted entirely away from Eliza. With the judge's permission, Eliza stood and presented a folder. It contained her meticulous, handwritten logs of the boys' care. Every dose of medication administered, every change in their condition, every late-night monitoring session. The records were a testament to her unwavering dedication. The judge examined the documents, his expression growing more serious. Damien was watching, his jaw tight. When the judge asked for the prosecution's response, he stood up before his lawyer could, his voice booming through the court. He accused Eliza of manipulating his children, of brainwashing them, of coaching them to tell this fantastical story. But his accusations now sounded hollow and desperate. The people in the room were no longer on his side. The judge calmly asked him to sit down. She announced that the new testimony required a full investigation. The boy's courage had changed the entire dynamic of the trial. Damien's power was slipping away. The jury members were scribbling furiously, looking at the case with fresh eyes. The judge ordered that Ms. Sterling be temporarily removed from the case, pending an investigation into the boy's claims. She stood, her face ashen, and retreated to the gallery. For the first time, the idea that this was all part of a larger conspiracy didn't seem so far-fetched. The twins had nothing to gain from lying. They had simply told their truth. And that truth was beginning to unravel a much bigger crime. Damien leaned forward, whispering frantically to his remaining lawyer, who seemed to be avoiding eye contact. The calm, untouchable billionaire was gone, replaced by a man consumed by frustration and fear. The court was no longer his stage. As the session ended for the day, the judge thanked the boys for their bravery. Eliza felt the immense weight on her shoulders begin to lift. She was still scared, but for the first time she felt like her truth mattered. As Damien walked out of the courtroom, his proud posture was gone. He looked like a defeated man. Eliza remained seated, holding her son's hands. The courtroom, once ready to condemn her, was now forced to question everything. The truth was no longer silent. The trial resumed with a new, palpable tension. The judge called Caroline Sterling to the stand. Her composure, once so unshakable, was now brittle. When the judge asked her to explain her presence near the medicine vault on the night in question, she fumbled. First, she claimed she had gotten lost looking for an office. Then she said she was investigating a strange noise. The contradictions hung in the air, obvious and damning.